Hey all, welcome to the home of sound science and truthful and accurate geopolitics. So I shared a video the other day of a talk by Dr. Jakob Nordangård, and it was fascinating and got a huge response. But I went ahead and got Dr. Nordangård directly, and we had a kind of Joe Rogan style long format podcast discussion about his talk and much more. So here it is, guys, and it really goes through detail on everything you need to know around how the world works, and especially explains the last few years and what's currently going on right as we speak. So please do share, get the message out there. It's a fantastic discussion and it's really, really entertaining as well, I truly feel. So consider it like a Sunday night movie. It's around 90 minutes long, and you will be entertained and surprised and shocked in equal measure. So here we go. So great to see you in person, Dr. Nordangård.
Thank you.
I struggle with that.
Enough.
Excellent. And you know what we might start with is a real quick, short intro to your kind of background. I mentioned some of the books on that, but to give people a feeling of how long you've been at kind of exploring and learning around all of these crucial events in our geopolitical history that lead to how the world works today.
I would say that it started like 20 years ago. I was a student in geography at Linköping University in Sweden and was investigating a lot about energy. And I wanted to know about the peak oil theory. Was it accurate? Was it real? I was kind of scared of the scenarios that they put up, and the civilization would break down and everything. So that got me into the university, and I wanted to get the answers. But I found out I didn't get the answers from people there. I had to investigate these things myself. And that started a new career for me. It eventually got me into doctoral studies. I have a background now as a PhD in technology and social change. The thing I was doing after the peak oil thing, I was investigating how the European biofuels policy and how European Union was acting to get Europe more independent from external sources of energy, how they wanted to, biofuels was one of these things. But at the time when I was doing this, the climate issue was everywhere. And that got me very interested in why do media just talk about the climate, but so little about energy security and the threat of being dependent on Russia and those things that I was looking into. So what really got me into these things was when I wanted to know, how did the climate issue begin? How did the climate issue, climate change, become a political issue? And so I asked one of my colleagues at the university, because I was at the Climate Policy Center in Norrköping. And he didn't know, he just knew that it started with IPCC in 1988. I don't know that much about what happened before. But he gave me a paper, a scientific paper about some of the prehistory, about some meetings in the 80s, climate meetings. I read this paper. The most interesting thing in this paper was those who funded these meetings, that was before the IPCC came about. It was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation. And for me, it was, wait a minute, why? This is strange, because I knew from, studying oil, the Rockefeller family and the Standard Oil complex and everything that they have been doing with the energy and oil for, built a civilization on oil. Why were they so interested in climate change that they actually funded these things? So that got me into a long research about where it began. So I write a paper about that. And that started it for me. And I found so much information about why they did it. So that became a part of my doctoral thesis, and also my later books, and especially the Rockefeller, this book, Rockefeller, and Klimatsmart Historia in Swedish. I have actually an English version of this.
Oh, excellent, because yeah, most of my audience, I have a good Swedish audience though, after spending years on COVID, but most people are English. But the great thing about that book is that it goes back to, for someone who wants to go deeper in the origins, it goes back to the 1800s or so, like right back to the big Rockefeller. And I remember I came across Rockefeller in my 10 years dealing with medical, industrial kind of corruption. I was in the health sphere for the last 10 years, still am. And I remember this classic one, that Rockefeller was seen as the father of the kind of pharmaceutical industry, essentially. Back in the early 1900s, he recognized if you can get people to move away from natural medicine, and he funded that. I mean, natural medicine as a competitive threat, and he wanted everything to move to doctors because they're pliable and pliant. And as part of a medical system with all doctors in it, and drugs being a massive moneymaker, you've got yourself a real captive market. So these guys were visionaries in a bad way, I guess.
Yes. Smart people. I mean, they took over everything and started to shape our future. And I saw it everywhere, and they have done it in education, and the funding of universities, and I mean, they have been everywhere. It's I remember when I was starting to write this book, it was like, oh, can I really have everything in just 400 pages? It would I would need like an encyclopedia in 25 books or something like that, because they have been so influential everywhere, and smart and strategic, and I think it's kind of impressive in a way.
It is, and I was interviewed by a New Zealand radio station this morning, and it was about all how we got here the last few years, and we touched a lot and mentioned your discussion, and also the Rockefellers, and I mentioned a load of other institutes, but we were musing on, and I've said this many times, Jakob, that ordinary people, the vast majority, simply can't encapsulate how smart and organized and strategic these organizations are. And they think it sounds like a conspiracy theory that the whole way our world works, and all of our politicians who seem to just take orders from above, and admittedly to a lot of normal people, the whole thing seems staged, especially COVID, which was absurd. But they can't quite believe that this is a long game of like century, and it comes through key influential families and organizations they create, and they are managing the future of the world. But they are, and that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just a credit to them, as you just said.
Exactly. I mean, that surprised me. I mean, the thing is, you go to university, and when I was starting to study these organizations and about the climate agenda, I mean, I stepped into these areas where I found out that, I mean, everything that my colleagues work with comes from more or less Rockefeller Foundation's work in the 50s. So when I point that out, I mean, it's like criticizing them, some of them thought. I remember when I had I was defending my thesis, and the opponent, he said in the beginning, you know, my department at the university in Lund, they have just received a big grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. So yeah. And also I've been at the Stockholm University, and I mean, they were so influential, and the Rockefeller money was there everywhere at the departments at the Stockholm University. So, And in that way, it's very, very hard to criticize because people think, but you can't. They think this is just this is the normal thing we do at this university. But when you find out that it actually comes from these people, and it's hard to point out.
Yeah, it goes back to how smart they are, because they would have predicted all of these things, and in the future, as these things begin to roll out, we may get resistance, and people may talk. So then we need to have the universities, we need to have a little money spread everywhere so people don't want to question us, and we need the media. We'll need control of the media, which they've astonishingly been successful at. I mean, particularly in the last 10 years, not just the Rockefellers, but all of the organizations that basically have a confluence of interests with them. And this is another thing I explain to people. It's not just this family, and it's not just this Gavi alliance, and it's not just the WHO that now is utterly corrupted, or the revolving door between the FDA and Big Pharma, which has been documented. All of these things have been documented. It's all of these and myriad more, and many other corporations like mass manufacturers and incidental profiteers that all jump together and recognize a scenario that's profitable or can extend their control. And that's why it seems magical and so lockstep, because they all recognize, they're smart people, smart organizations, and they recognize opportunities and they jump. And then you get madness. That's it.
Yeah.
So, but that probably pivots us into then this crucial family, which has become a cliche almost, because there's been enough people pointing out or realizing what you realize to begin to ask questions. And that alone has been branded conspiracy theory to even question them and look at their actual factual actions. This is a weapon against anyone who asks questions. Conspiracy theory. Boom, boom, boom.
No, and it's. I mean, you just mentioned their name, and
that's enough.
Rockefeller.
Oh, Rockefeller. Oh, aliens.
Semitic conspiracy theory, and they are not even Jews, and so no. No, it has been hard. To actually, I wrote. I mean, I was writing about these things at the university, and it's not easy. Even though there are a lot of academic works that are about the Rockefeller foundations and other institutions. A lot of it. It's so much written, and even and they are so good at themselves. They have one of the best archives in the world, the Rockefeller archives. So, I mean, they have all of it, and then they have academians that actually write about what they are doing. So it's very easy to compile these things. So I mean, in a way, they have academians that kind of write their conspiracy theories in a way. So,
yeah. Well, of course, they can easily fund all these academic people to write this, and then they fill the space. They swamp the space with writings, presumably much of it positive because they're funding. So lots of positive stuff about the foundation and what they're doing. But you're right, that leaves a record in the end of what they're doing. And if you stand back and look at it, you say, oh my God. I mean, do you remember that? I think it was Time magazine, or maybe it was Rolling Stone, that brilliant journalist did I think it was Goldman Sachs, and described it as a giant vampire squid with its tentacles in every part of society, sucking the life out. And it was a huge squid drawing. It was kind of famous. Well, I just think of all these different groups, whether it's Gates or Rockefeller, they're just like enormous bloated ticks that are feeding off the kind of general, bovine populations who just don't understand that there are really smart guys, and there have been for all of human history. I mean, look at the Roman Empire and the Roman families that ran the whole show. We've seen loads of dramas, the Borgias, the popes. We've always had Shaka Zulu in Africa, going back a long way. We've always had powerful, kind of sociopathic people of wealth and power who have wanted to run it all. Once they have more money than they can actually spend on stuff they want, the next thing is power. I mean, they're driven people, so they want power, intergenerational. They don't even care, it's quite clear to me, that they won't live to see the power increasing and control. They're happy their sons or grandsons will inherit this. I mean, they're pretty sick puppies.
Yeah. I mean, David Rockefeller said that in his memoirs, that he worked for something that was bigger than him. I mean, it's not just to work for profits and making good business and everything. He worked for something that was much greater than this, greater than even his family.
In an evil way, but of course, anyone reading that would assume he meant greater in a good way.
He saw it that way. I think if you look into what the Rockefellers say in there, I mean, I've read so much biographies and everything. I mean, David Rockefeller wanted to create a better system for the world, a more efficient system, more or less work like a factory.
Yeah.
But in his mind, it was a good thing. We will make these things better. It's better to have this expert-run society than a society run by politicians that just want to gain their own power. And it's better we sort this out. We do it much better than everyone else. I think he would. It isn't just being evil. I don't think he thought of himself as evil, but he was on a mission to
and
more.
You know, oh yeah, absolutely, Jakob. And when I use that word, it's kind of my way of using it, that I have judged that where that heads is to dystopia. So yeah, it's the wrong word to use to convey how he felt. He just thinks he's a master of the universe. All of his friends and network are masters of the universe, and they can come together and run this ant farm properly, like a factory, like you say, or a corporation. And they believe it, and they don't think it's particularly bad. They're looking after the ants. That's the way I sometimes think of it.
Exactly.
But once it progresses, there's only one way that kind of technocracy ends up, and we know where it ends up.
Yeah.
They can die, new guys come in, and it ends up in dystopia. It's just the natural evolution. And the funny thing is, Jakob, that the politicians, who I have no respect for, especially nowadays, I mean, they're just unbelievably outrageously useless. That's true. But when the politicians are all squabbling amongst themselves and just interested in their own interests, you get an inefficient world and you get a lot of problems. But you don't get a long-term dystopia because they're focused on their own enrichment, and then they move on and they get a yacht or whatever. But Rockefeller, ironically, his vision is the one with the potential to go to total dystopia. And I guess he doesn't even see that.
Yeah, and that's the way with... I remember from writing my Rockefeller book, it was a quote that politicians, they only think for the next election, and business leaders, it's the next
business cycle or something.
Business, yeah, exactly. But we, the philanthropist, it's a very hard word to say, philanthropist. We can work for decades, centuries.
With our foundations and our legacy, and we, of course, culturally train our offspring, and we hand down the family vision for the ant farm, if you will. Yeah, and that's where we are.
They have a long perspective on their planning for what they are doing.
Yeah, and a good friend of mine...
And all the thing, I mean, the Rockefellers now, David Rockefeller, he passed away in 2017, and he leaves it to a new generation. And they have more or less have to continue this. The thing is, I don't think that every Rockefeller agree on these things. There are exceptions. I know exceptions from that. But those who are in the lead, they have to go along with this long-term agenda.
Yeah. And, you know, if they step off this or fade away, which is very unlikely because it's a dynasty thing handed down. But if they did step up, at this stage, my perception is the monster's been created. So they've done enough groundwork to create the monster that's now self-sufficient. And now you have Schwab and you have Gates jumping in and you have all the other characters. So this thing has a life of its own now, even if they bowed out.
Yeah. It doesn't matter if the Rockefeller steps out.
Yeah.
Moving.
The monster has been birthed and now it's able to feed itself so they can mummy can move on.
Kind of.
Okay, so that brings us perfectly into just starting and doing a whirlwind tour of your fantastic talk, and I'll put the link below to the actual talk. But just to move through it quickly, and I'll just throw some inputs in, and again, starting with the Rockefellers in the 50s, and we see the introduction of the climate idea that came in not from scientists. Lots of scientists were funded afterwards to put some science onto it. That's easy. You can just put it on like paper mache and you can make your image. But they started with just a strategic thing with climate catastrophe or fear and pandemic fear became the two things that I guess they brainstormed on their whiteboard as useful tools going into the future. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. The thing for when I started this, it was that it was population control. That was the one of the main issue: population and the control of resources, and both the health issue, that's about population, and climate, that is about resources. So it was a perfect tool. And you can follow their thinking through the 50s and how they also funded some important, I wouldn't say scientists, but that's what they call them, scientists, more like people that are interested in getting a good career. Most were career people that got hold on a new field and could build a new institutions that were investigating this new issue. Rockefeller Foundation and other big foundations stepped in and funded this so that they could harvest the result some years later and then started to put it into the political scene.
Yeah, and it kind of did take around 20 years, I think, until maybe, I'm guessing, the 70s, where they began to get it to break through into the newspapers. I think the 70s people started talking in newspapers about ice ages coming. Wherever they got those, well, now we know where they came from, their origin, but they were talking about ice ages, and then they switched and figured, well, maybe warming's a better one. So you could see this kind of morphing of the model.
Yeah, because we had a meeting in Sweden, outside Stockholm, in Uppsala, and it was a meeting that was held before the Stockholm conference, the Stockholm United Nations Stockholm conference of the environment. What they were discussing was the climate and how humans could influence the climate. That was the question.
Ooh.
And so they had two schools. One that said that if the carbon dioxide theory, if we burn fossil fuels, carbon emissions will be released and it will get warmer. Or the other side said, oh, no, if we burn fossil fuels, we will release aerosols in the air that will block the sun from coming in and getting colder. And it took some time before they decided to, and I think that's because first it got a little colder in the 70s, then it started to get warmer. So we decided that this is the thing. It is carbon dioxide that is the main main thing in this.
And in fairness, they made the right call. Like we said, they're smart guys in certain ways, because CO2 is perfect, because we are making it. It has gone up. 150 parts per million approximately. It's still vastly below the historical levels. And historically, the temperature changes of the Earth, the CO2 changed around 600 or 800 years later. And the reason is when the Earth's temperature changes for complex reasons, including our position in the solar system, interestingly, these cycles, then the water, of course, is less absorption capability for the masses of CO2 that's in the oceans. So they release some. So the CO2 tends to go up after the temperature. But it didn't matter to these guys because they got a simple little thing. CO2 goes up, causes warming, and look, it associates in the past with higher temperatures. Simple scam.
Yeah, very simple. The thing is, when I was starting to investigate these things, when I was writing about peak oil and energy and these things, I wanted to know about the climate because that became very influential on the scene in science and in media and everywhere. So I decided I have to look into this and study the climate issue and what is the science behind it. And it took me no more than a couple of days just to, there's something fishy here. This isn't because what I knew before was that now the scientists, it's agreed on that it's humans that influence the climate and everything. So now it's we don't have to debate it anymore. And when I looked into it, it's just, but you can prove this. It's not, this isn't science, and it's just modeling. And how can you actually know? When I found out that it's just a bitty portion of the carbon emissions that are from humans, compared to every carbon that is released every year. It's just a tiny bit. So how can we humans influence the climate in that way that they say? It doesn't make sense. And I started to discuss this with my colleagues, but they said, I trust the science, I trust the IPCC. They never wanted to investigate these things themselves or look for and that's not science for me, because science is just to we say
challenge.
Challenge,
debate.
Yeah.
The vast majority of scientists, and I've certainly seen this in the last 10 years in the health thing with cholesterol and fat and all the nonsense we were sold that's way up here or way up there with the stuff we're talking about now. But the vast majority of scientists are not scientists by my definition. I'm a professional problem solver in corporate for 30 years, and we always strive to disprove our favorite hypothesis. Alec Professor Karl Popper, you must try to disprove. If you cannot disprove, you've now strengthened the hypothesis. But any idiot can go and find corroborating data that appears to support the hypothesis. But the key of science is finding a disproving fact, a black swan, and that strengthens the case if that cannot be found. Otherwise, you need to redo the hypothesis. But none of the scientists are doing that because it's all a career to them now, it appears. They've kind of sold out. It's very sad. And actually, the IPCC you mentioned, even going, and I think this was Bjorn Lomborg or one of these great climate people who's a rationalist, even if you use their figures and you project out to 2100 and you accept their expected temperature increase, whatever it is, 1.5, 1.6, the GDP reduction between now and then, the GDP of the world is going to be vastly higher, obviously, out then in 2100. And it'll be around 1.5% or 1% lower than it would have been, even if you accept their 1.5 degrees. And there is no catastrophe. Even the IPCC themselves do all the modelling, but then everyone else involved takes it and makes it a catastrophe. They don't claim there's a catastrophe. They just provide this temperature. But when you model that properly and look at an impact on humans, it's a nothing burger. over the next 80 years. Even if you accept their figure, it's still not a catastrophe. It's a slight shifting of stuff in the world that won't really change a whole lot. Like, so on multi-level, it's not rational.
No, it isn't. They you just scratch your head with all the stupidity in this, and that nobody questions it at all. And I know that Björn Lomborg, his books from university days when I was a student, and one teacher, he had this Björn Lomborg book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, and he wanted the students to read it, to get that view as well. But it almost became a riot because you can't use this climate deniers book.
Yeah.
So and that, that's the thing with the propaganda. All these students that come to the university and they are already have this opinion. We know that this is the way, and they come in as activists. So if you want to, yeah. So if you want to give the students another view, balanced view, challenge them, it's more or less impossible today. And this was like 15 years ago. So now I don't think it's Björn Lomborg his books won't be you haven't mentioned them today.
Yeah. So again, this is just another example. When you throw together some kind of pseudoscience, and modeling is mostly pseudoscience the way it's been used. We use modeling in engineering, but it's actually quite accurate, and finite element analysis. And you could design beams and strengths of materials, and they actually turned out what the model said. That's real modeling. But the modeling from Neil Ferguson and, Gates-funded Imperial College, and this modeling on climate, this is pie in the sky stuff, and it's for an agenda. Clearly, and anyone who thinks otherwise is just already brainwashed. And I'm not a climate denier, because I acknowledge that the CO2 is rising, because the data says that. I acknowledge it can have an effect on temperature, because the data indicates that. I think it's largely irrelevant, but I acknowledge it. So there's no denial, just like Bjorn, there's no denial. I'll even accept the IPCC figures of 1.2 degrees. I don't agree with them, but, I'll say I'll give them a benefit of the doubt. I'll accept them. I won't deny them. I'll say they're possible. But then when you project them, they don't really make any difference to the world. And that means the whole thing is politics and agenda. It's just everywhere you look, there's no question. And the denial of debate, that's a dead giveaway. Once you see powerful propaganda, relentless, telling us what we already know. That's one definition of propaganda from Dr. John, his name escapes me, from COVID in UK. He was brilliant. But the definition he had of propaganda was, if you keep getting told again and again what you already know, that's propaganda. And I'd say if you also see censorship and shutting down of debate, you know that whatever is being pushed is corrupt. I'm not sure there's an exception to that, really. In history, the censors have always been the bad guys. Maybe an exception in a world war where you have to censor strategically, you're fighting for your life, for your country. But outside of that scenario, the censors have always been the bad guys. And here we are. Don't even start me about COVID. So let's spin now from that climate kind of lunacy and move the story on into the 70s. I know there was a lady who wrote the book, Protecting a Small Planet, but then it moved on to other characters, your story to the WEF.
Yes, I think it was the Barbara Ward book about Spaceship Earth, the care and maintenance of a small planet.
Yeah.
Yes, because that's what it's all about. They want to tell us that our little planet is fragile and it has to be protected. And it has to be protected by these guys. And in her case, a girl.
And it evolved then. So she had written the book, which was their vision. For me, this is the excuse to push forward the agenda, the multi-generational agenda. You need excuses. Another one they mentioned, because they had identified climate catastrophe as something scary, that would get people on board. And they also identified pandemics.
Yes. I mean, they did that first in the 50s, and they talked about global health issues. And then it evolved to pandemics. But the big thing with pandemics, I mean, it came not in the 70s. It was in the beginning of after the millennium shift, where we really started to discuss these things with the World Economic Forum and the World Economic Forum's global risks reports. But just before that, it was another very, very interesting document that I talk a lot about, that's called The Great Transition. I don't know if you remember that from our presentation. We had the Brundtland Commission, and we had the Agenda 21 agreement in the beginning of the 90s. And just after that, they started a program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation that they wanted to investigate the future, and how could we go from the situation that we have today to the order that they had with the countries that were influential. And this was just after the Cold War. But now they wanted to discuss how we could evolve this to a planetary civilization. A planetary civilization with also institutions that could take care of the planet. More or less, they didn't say a world government, but they spoke about a world authority. And how would they get to this? So they had a report that came out like in 2002 that was called Great Transition, The Promises and Lures of Our Times. And in this report, they had these scenarios. One that was more the conventional, with business as usual, and by the market forces were leading the way, and one was with policy reforms. That was the conventional way to do things. And then they had a breakdown scenario that could evolve into something they called the fortress world, or a total breakdown society. Everything would collapse. And the last scenarios was their preferred scenario. And this was called the new paradigm. And they had also had, together with the new paradigm, we had eco-communities. So this was the sustainable development way. And in that was the preferred way. And if you read that, that's kind of an utopian society. Everything is perfect, everything is good, and we have this planetary civilization where we have this big, happy global family. And yeah.
But we own nothing, though, right? But we're happy.
Yeah.
And who owns it all if we, the masses, own nothing? Someone's got to own it. Well, guess who? The guys who are planning all of this stuff over a century. Yeah, it's almost cliched. And that reminds me, you mentioned 2002, Jakob, but I have the document I downloaded way back in 2020. I knew it was critical. The Rockefeller Institute Lockstep. And I think that came out in 2010.
Yes, exactly. But I must mention, in this Great Transition, they talk about triggers for transformation, how to kickstart this process, this transformation to this new planetary society. And that is, they talk about financial crisis, we talk about the end of oil, they talk about pandemics. So they had this in the scenarios. And these scenarios was, they were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the United Nations Environmental Program, and also some Japanese foundation called Nippon Foundation. And we also found Stephen Rockefeller very involved in this. Stephen Rockefeller was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the former vice president of the United States, and of course very involved in this in the 50s, all these ideas. So and when you follow this, you find these the sons of those who were responsible for this in the 50s, for the thinking. Or Nelson didn't think; he had a brain trust that made the thinking for him. But anyway, you find that the new generation comes in and continue the agenda. So they had this talk about crisis and a big pandemic that could kickstart. They actually said a major health crisis will be the start of the crisis era. When that kicks in, we will have reforms of the world. Something that we are, or the United Nations, they are actually discussing these things nowadays. Yeah. And after that, in 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation again comes out with a new scenario report, scenarios for technology and international development, I think it's called. They have employed people that are futurists that have been doing these scenarios, and we found one guy in this called Peter Schwartz that is very influential. He was working at the Shell scenario group in the 80s. That predicted that the Soviet Union would fall. Made a lot of famous prediction at that time. And in that report, they of course have this lockstep scenario that is very similar to what actually happened. So when the pandemic came in 2020. And when you follow this from, that's what I've been trying to do. I started when the pandemic came. I wanted to, because I had written about Rockefeller and climate and know a lot about the thinking, I knew immediately where to look. So I found these documents and could go back all the way to the 50s and unlock this mystery.
Yeah, and it's so, the irony is, there's a thing that conspiracy theorists obviously are in some kind of cult, true ones, and they think up all kinds of fantastical, silly stuff, and they're convinced. But for me, this is so self-evident. In fairness, with your work and many others' work and work I've done myself, you pull the data as a hardcore problem-solving scientist, and I have no emotions. I don't get emotional or excited about these terrible things, not because I have no feelings, but because I know as an analyst, as a problem solver, as someone who does analysis to put together how the real world works, whether it's in physics, chemistry, or geopolitics, to me makes no difference, or psychology. I managed people for 20 years. I'm into psychology, and you can treat problems with people in the same way as you can treat physics problems. Once you know all the rules and the underlying science of it, you can do that. But I don't have any emotion. But this to me is so self-evident, with all the data and with the clear pattern. Think of it like a detective who comes in emotionless, and you got means, method, opportunity. In criminology, there's a way you follow it, and you stay aloof. And when you look at this whole scenario, it's so clear over the last 50, 60, 70 years, and over the last 10 years as it evolved and came to fruition, it's self-evident that this thing is a conspiracy of sorts, but not really secret. And a conspiracy doesn't have to be secret.
Yeah, exactly. It isn't secret. They have told us this all the time. And the evidence is everywhere. It's very easy to find but you have to know where to look. That's
true.
Because they won't tell you on the television about these reports, or now the great transition report has come out and this discusses our future and how it will evolve. No, of course they don't mention it. And they hardly mention what happens on, the big meetings at the United Nations. That's very, when we decided this Agenda 2030, it wasn't not a big thing on television. We only talked about the climate. We only talked about Paris. I mean, hardly I know about these things because, it came afterwards. And when the documents were signed, now it's ready. It's you that has decided. As you are a part of United Nations, your country has signed up to this. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, totally unwittingly and with no knowledge. Talk about no informed consent. Of course no one's informed because the media won't cover it. And in the last 20, 30 years, the media has become owned by advertisers and government funders and just all the guys we're talking about. You know, one thing, just before we leave the last topic, though, and move on to the next step in lockstep, it was like all of the Rockefeller stuff that you described just there, that was all strategic positioning and preparation and kind of modeling of a sort of scenarios and then pointing to their favored one by showing really nasty ones and then a beautiful one. Oldest trick con man in the book.
It is. It's very, very
basic con. But that was strategic. And then interestingly, just to finish on that was the strategic long game. But then we saw the tactical. So I would see swine flu 2009, which the world in fairness recognized afterwards as an absolute debacle and a con job. That's accepted. But 10 years later then, Event 201, 2019, the Gates Foundation brings in all the leaders and media and politicians and basically says, if there was, for instance, a coronavirus epidemic, presumably in the next 30 years, we need to all prepare what we're going to do. And everything they said was around censorship and control of people. And it all came to pass 6 months later. I mean, this is so obviously a tactical refresher for all the key players just before the program launches. It's just so obvious. And yet no one covered it in the media and no one really knows about it. Or it's called a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it
astonishing.
It was very obvious when I looked into it. It was so, and you find the same actors every time.
Every time.
Yeah, and also, people don't remember anything. The thing with the swine flu. I remember I was at the university as a doctor student at that time, and I thought that at that time, this swine flu. I even showed my students because I had this course covering. We're discussing crisis and crisis. So I asked my students to look into crisis that has changed the world. And I actually showed them, because this was at the time of the swine flu, I showed them a movie or a commercial from the 70s about the swine flu in the United States. And I don't know if you know about that one.
Oh, yeah. I only found out since COVID in 2020 when I began to look back like you. And I saw, they ran out of vaccine, and a lot of people were hurt.
We had to stop this because they want to convince people to take the vaccines and everything, and they had to stop because it got very nasty and problematic. And then they used it again, the same formula but global. And the thing was, when I had this exercise with my students, they could hardly look back more than like 1 or 2 years when we were, because I wanted them to find a crisis now that has actually affected us and affected policy in the world, and it was like okay, if I write crisis and in Google, what is the top result? And that was what we were discussing at the seminar later. And it's like, and I had this course some years later, and at the same time we had this. It was about the plastic in the oceans, this plastic mountain in the Pacific Ocean, I think it was, and it was everywhere in media, and that was what the students were talking about. Only that crisis. They couldn't go back like 10 years. They couldn't discuss things that were even, 20 years or 30 years. No, it was just this tiny time frame that were in their mind. And only the things that media had told them. They couldn't actually go outside the box.
Yeah,
maybe 1 out of 30 students could do that.
Yeah,
so that it's a telling thing, because people don't remember. So when the pandemic comes in 2020, they suddenly don't remember these things that happened with the swine flu and the criticism that came afterwards and everything. And we had great journalists that actually took up some things about the swine flu afterwards, but it just vanished. And that's very interesting to see how people actually work. The psychology of people. That you said that you worked with psychology, wasn't it?
Oh, not professionally with accreditation, but 20 years managing large teams of people, HR, direct managing them, and my general interest. Also, I'm a World War II buff, so I'm kind of the opposite. I'm fascinated by history in general, but so few people are, unfortunately. But psychology, I interviewed Professor Matthias Desmet. You're probably familiar. Yeah, great discussion. And it really helped a lot of my viewers and a lot of people understand this question. How can everyone have gone mad when it's so obviously kind of, it's hurting old people, but there's no crisis. How can everyone have gone into lockstep? It's absurd. And he was very helpful in explaining, not blaming the people, though some people accused him of blaming the people rather than the Rockefellers, etc. But the reality was he was just explaining that the big part of the problem is the people. They don't cause the issue, the bad guys do. But the people allow themselves to go into mass formation and they let the bad guys win. And it's a very important point, I think. And yeah, the psychology of humans is weak. I used to joke for many years now, I used to say people are goldfish. The goldfish goes around the bowl, and by the time he just comes around to the other side of the bowl, he's forgotten where he started. He just keeps going. People are like goldfish. 2009 swine flu was covered in Der Spiegel by some of the journalists you probably mean. Incredible article showing the massive corruption. But in Corona, COVID, Der Spiegel just pushed lockdowns. But in the intervening 10 years, the Cochrane collaboration got a load of money from foundations. Spiegel gets a lot of money. Guardian gets masses of money from Gates. Imperial College London got $300 and something million over the last 8 years from Bill and Melinda. And you could go on all day. All the institutions are feeding money into the media.
Yeah, exactly. That's because, the swine flu, we learned things from the swine flu.
They did. Dry run.
The media acted, and how can we correct this in the future?
Yeah. It's so clear. Literally, I call that in the last few years. I keep referring to swine flu. I shared the Der Spiegel article so people are reminded how the world used to actually realize stuff and reporters actually wrote about it. But, it was a dress rehearsal, I view. And, Jakob, at the time, and again, I'm not self-edifying here, but because of my nature as a problem solver, and show me the data was always my phrase for 20 plus years, I'm hardcore on that. You show me the data, and then if you can explain to me how the data says X, fine. Otherwise, I won't believe it. I can't. The data has to show it.
Yes.
And back in 2009, I remember swine flu coming up, and I saw it all over the news. And my instinct was, this is bollocks. This is just pharma wanting to sell treatments, and they're bigging it up.
Yeah.
And I did look and I checked it out insofar as I could. And I went to find the key data. Who's dying and how many people are dying? And all I could find with all of the breathless articles and all of the hype, the only data I could find, which meant the only data that existed, because they would show us data if it said it was a problem, was a bunch of Mexican drug addicts. And they were calling it the Mexican virus at first because they had a bunch of drug-affected, immunocompromised people died. And then there was another lady who was a marathon runner who got it. And before she recovered, she started hard training. And then she got a relapse. But outside of that, I just couldn't find any deaths really worth a damn. And I said, this is clearly a fraud. And interestingly, my own father told me a story many years ago. He's dead a long time now. But he got a flu back when he was in his 40s. And they called the priest and I had the mass in the house because after the flu, he had not recovered and he went back to work and he got a relapse. So I knew that was a phenomenon that could happen with any illness. You could die when you get a relapse. Your immune system is under pressure with a flu. And then before you're recovered properly, you overexert yourself and you can go into a catastrophic nosedive. So swine flu, clearly no one worth a damn was dying and the world was going mad. So I said, this is a joke. My wife asked me a few months later, are you coming down to the local place in Dublin to get the vaccine? I said, what vaccine? I've never been anti-vax, never until the COVID vax. And she said, for the swine flu, because her mother was a nurse. And the medical profession in Ireland, they fall 100% for all these things. They're gone. And the mother was insisting you should get the vaccine. And I said to my wife, I wasn't against it. I just didn't care. I said, but that's a joke. And I said it to her and she said, oh, well, you know. So she went down with the kids and everyone got the vaccine. And I just shrugged my shoulders. It was very interesting to look back on that now. But that was a dress rehearsal. Yeah, clear as day.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and they also tested how in different countries, how many will comply, who will go to and take the vaccine shot. And I remember when we were looking into these things, this student, this university course, and it was in Sweden, I think it was like 80%. 80% go and take vaccines. But in France, it was like 10%.
Yeah, well,
and that can be an explanation on how hard they acted in some countries. In Sweden, it was not that hard. People comply; they do what the authorities tell them to do. So they didn't need to do these hard lockdowns in Sweden. People did it anyway.
That was
so I think that was also a part of this. They gained data from every country. How did it work out? How will we do the next time? And the thing is now we have tested it again. The big thing. So for the next time,
no,
I won't.
Yeah, no, that's a key point, and it has come up about Sweden. Now, I think also, in fairness to Anders Tegnell and Gisecki, I think they also had this constitutional lack of ability of the government to override the...
Yeah, they have it, of course.
Yeah. And they did a great job because, to be honest, Sweden vaccination, like you say, 80% took it anyway, or 90%. They did not need it. But on the other hand, Sweden provided the ultimate case control proof that the lockdowns en masse did nothing. They had the lowest mortality excess in all of OECD with no lockdowns, no mass, and kids in 16 maintained in school throughout. So that was a service they gave to humanity, although sadly not enough people know that. They disproved the lockdown en masse nonsense on their own. But that point about the countries, we can see, like a detective, we can look for motive, means and opportunity again. And just on that point, France, 10%. And look what they got. They were given young global leader Macron. And he generated literally a dystopia, a rolling dystopia. And he broke the will of the French over those 2 years. It's shocking.
Yeah.
And the countries, England, they had a mixed bag because the British are proud and quite independent. And it looks like that these con men or organizations, they didn't quite get the UK under control. So there was a lot of rebellion popping out, but they still brought the game home. Ireland was a joke because I've always joked for 10 years that Ireland is a vassal state of pharmaceutical corporations because we're just ridiculous. Like, we get a lot of jobs from pharma. 60% of our GDP is biotech and pharma. And we've just gone pharma mad for jobs. So naturally, Ireland had the hardest lockdowns in Europe. It just goes with the turf. Yeah, the whole thing was so surreal. And now we can look back and just see that it's all part of a very well structured long-term strategic plan for the management of the world. And to your point, Jakob, the guys who initiated it, I don't think now the guys running the show anymore so much, but the guys who initiated it were not thinking of this whole endeavor as evil. They were thinking it's only right and proper that the elites and the people who are smart should better manage the world. They believed it, but now I think it's morphed where a lot of bad actors have got on board and profiteers, and now it's getting into the true dystopian kind of spinning wheel. What do you reckon?
Yeah, of course it has, because that's what's happened. I don't think, even if you have this long view strategic planning, I don't think you really know what will happen in the end. It's impossible because it's so many people involved, so many organizations, and you don't really know what will happen in the end. So,
yeah.
But the bad thing, of course, is that it has become more dystopian, because when you look at the strategies they had, they wanted the people to choose the right way. It's like when we come to 2020, it's like we wanted to have come much further than we have done. So we have to use scenario B, alternative B, and that is the more harsh methodology to do this. So I think in their minds, if just people will do the right thing, but they didn't. And it was I can think about the First World War, when we had this. I mean, in the 19th century, it was internationalism that came, the social democrats and all these movements, and they wanted to unite the world, create the workers' paradise. But when the First World War came, people were fighting for their countries because it's very hard to fight for something. I mean, what is the global society that we are fighting for? What is it? So people, they fight for their community, the things that they can see and feel. Not a big vision that these people, these very smart people have, because they are the ones that can travel freely in the world, and they could do it at that time as well. But it was very surprising for them that people, they actually believe in their own communities and want to fight for that, not this big idea. So I mean, they have in the 20th century, they have worked on this all the time, and we have the United Nations, everything, and they have worked very hard, especially in Sweden with the United Nations, and to have us to almost, you shouldn't even think about Sweden. To think about Sweden and the national anthem or the Swedish flag. That's what nationalists do. So we almost. I mean, I remember from early school days, it was more like, oh, United Nations, and it was this United Nations Day, and everyone should sing these songs that we were all a big global family and everything. And so we had, with education and that indoctrination, we have tried hard to get us to that, but it's not easy, and I think it's impossible in the end to do that, because we have a wide cultural variety in the world, and to think that we can merge everything to create something standardized, it's impossible. So that's why we now more or less we want this. We want this society. We more or less have to force it through. And I've thought about that as well when we have created this mess, and so now we actually have people starting to talk with each other from very different countries to actually do something about it. So in a kind of way, we are starting to work against this, but I don't think in the end that it will result in a global society. It's more or less that we humans, we work together to because we have to defend ourselves from this system, this I would say enslavement system, this technocratic society. So we do that, but when we have defended, I don't think it will result in that we create a world government for that. But the thing, when you actually read this Great Transition report, we talk about that as well. It could be a thing if we have this global technocratic dictatorship taking over, resistance will grow, and they talk about how to create and influence this movement in order to give it this global, or more you can say this new age sort of vibe, and feel for the world. We are one family and everything, and we will defeat this globalists and build our own global world. So
they're smart guys, and they know the psychology, they've got the psychologists, they know the finances, they know the political. They've done extremely well, but you're absolutely right. All I see in the last few years, and it was hyper accelerated after COVID as they doubled down to get the game home, was divisiveness. Anti-vax against vax, people who like their patriotism and like their culture and their national anthems, you call them far right, you call them extreme. Our own Prime Minister said a couple of years ago, astonishingly, we're a country with huge pride in our nationalism and our eventual win against the British occupation of 700 or 800 years. We celebrate it all, the rising of 1916. We are very like that, and we have Irish cultural games, Gaelic games, that still are big in spite of soccer and rugby. But look at our country the last few years. Our own Prime Minister said recently, and he was caught on tape, and he was saying this outdated idea of sovereignty is ridiculous and outdated. And he was basically talking about we need to get rid of sovereignty. We need to get rid of this stuff. That's the kind of useful idiot we've got. He's not in with all of these influencers. He's a classic useful idiot. He's just, drunk the Kool-Aid and is championing all this stuff about the EU and break down the borders. We need more immigration. We need to make a homogenous blob of humanity. Well, of course the people driving all the nonsense we discussed want exactly that, a homogenous blob of humanity. If you have all these different nationalities, what you've actually got is healthy diversity in the world. People can travel to other countries nearby and see a different culture. We can travel back the other way. It's celebrating diversity and culture. But they want to get rid of all that and just make a blob. That's an ant farm, right?
yeah, it is.
That's it.
What a dead and uninspiring world it will be.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to get to travel to all these countries and cultures and taking part of it. It's wonderful, and to smash it is just so stupid.
Oh, it's criminal because that is the beauty of humanity, that everyone evolved with different practices. And once they're not fighting each other, and in fairness, in the past, these differences in culture led to conflicts. But we actually, decades ago in the West, moved into a stable maintenance of different cultures where now it could become a rich cultural experience to go to different countries and experience different cultures joyfully and then come back home and you're back to your normal world. It was just perfect. It was the high point, the zenith of civilization, I think. And now we have these buggers want to drag us down, right?
Yeah.
It's clear as day. But our killer problem is that the majority of people would just simply not see that. They would not see the attacks on their cultures. They just think, well, but it's about equity. It's about fairness. It's about equal opportunities for people all over the world. Well, no, that's the narrative. But the goal is what we just said. It's a blancmange, a homogenous blob of humanity, just grey, head in the phone, and we can just basically manage them like ants. A bit like, I'm sorry to say it, and I don't mean to be anti-China, but China is run as a corporation, social credit scores.
Yeah.
It's run as a massive corporation, and I ran manager roles in corporations. And the workers, we all pretend we're all in this together. But as soon as a new VP comes in with something unpopular, we in the management team had to roll it out. And employees had to be dealt with if they became too argumentative. We had methods. China is run like a corporation. It's the VPs who run it, and they run it with an iron fist. Europe was not like a corporation. It was like a bunch of healthy different communities and cultures, like we said. But they want it like China. That's clear as day. It'll be more efficient, and we could manage it better. But come on, it's dystopia.
Yeah, it was what David Rockefeller said when he went to China in the 70s. He thought it was a good experiment.
That's it.
Chairman Mao has made a tremendous job with this.
Yeah. And multiple of the characters today who are supporting this lunacy, multiples of those have been caught kind of praising China. I think Trudeau was caught praising China. Of course, he's a young global leader of the WEF as well. Ardern in New Zealand, complete insanity in New Zealand. Well, Ardern's a young global leader. And I know we have to roll to a close now shortly, but I will attach the link to your talk, which goes through all of the other stuff and Schwab in detail and everything, in fairness. This has more been a discussion. But the young global leaders, Klaus Schwab himself has said it publicly, that we have, half the cabinet in Canada. They are with us, was his phrase. We have young global leaders.
Penetrated the governments.
Penetrate the governments. Of course, it had to be sexual language, right? He's German. And they say it. And he was recorded on a buttonhole camera. It's quite clearly because of the angle. He did not know he was being recorded. He's being recorded from here. And someone's asking him, what about the church? Is the church all okay with the plans? And because he doesn't realize he's recorded, he said, yes, we have enormous progress, with the church, and we have many leaders now engaged with World Economic Forum. And he basically says, yeah, we got the church too. And that was clear as day. You saw the Pope. He minted a coin for the Vatican showing, I'll put the picture up on the screen when I edit this, showing not just a person being vaccinated and celebrating this brand new drug technology platform that was coerced onto the population. Whatever your feelings about it, it's insane. I know people in pharmaceutical regulatory roles who just said, this is astonishing. They're breaking every rule. So that's a fact. That's not anti-vax. But they made a coin with a young person getting vaccinated, with a doctor with his hand on the shoulder and a lady, a coin celebrating the COVID vaccine. I mean, you couldn't make this up.
Oh, no, you couldn't.
Jump the shark. But here, any last thoughts on this? But again, for everyone watching this, enjoying this conversation, you have to watch the 40-minute presentation by Jakob in the link below, because that's a flowing, proper presentation with all the slides and pictures and brings you through the story. We've jumped around it a bit here in a more discursive way. But anyway, we'll close this, Jakob, though we'll be coming back again, I'm sure.
Any closing words? Well, the things what we haven't discussed, but I think is very important. It is the United Nations.
Let's do that. Let's actually take a few minutes, because as you said in your talk, I remember the exact phrase, the Rockefellers see the United Nations as kind of their private club. So let's open that one out for another several minutes, because you're right, that's key.
Yeah, it is. It is actually my last book. This is called The Digital World Brain, and it discusses the future, because what came out of this, the Great Reset, that I was also talking about in my talk in Malmö, that was Antonio Guterres. He talked about the Great Reset, and that they wanted to create this new, more or less, system to better manage the world. And after that, 1 year after the Great Reset, United Nations released a report called Our Common Agenda that comes up with proposals for how more efficiently run the world, and how the United Nations will step up to be not just be this peace organization that has not had that much power, to give the United Nations more teeth, more muscles. And so I have gone through this report, and the title of my book, The Digital World Brain, is about what I found out, what they want to create, what is the goal with this, Our Common Agenda. So I have investigated also all the where this proposal comes from, and you always find the World Economic Forum very close, working with United Nations, and you also find these big think tanks like the Club of Rome and a couple of other big influential organizations working with this. And you find the key people, like there are a big part of the new United Nations 2.0 is we talk about upgrading. And so they have had this report about digitization that was headed by Melinda Gates and also Jack Ma from Alibaba Group. They are the one that Guterres gave the job to create this new digital agenda that is they want to push through with this Our Common Agenda report, to create more or less a digital world brain where every global citizen, as they refer to, and this is stated in the Global Sustainable Development Goals. They are working for everyone to be a global citizen. Yeah. And so everyone should be included in this digitized world, and have a right to have a digital ID. And
ID 2020.
We have a right to. And we talk about the new social contract.
Oh yeah.
And no new social contract. That's for the planetary global society, and we have obligations like for taking care of the planet, climate change, and everything that is involved in that. How our energy consumption and our emissions and everything. And then they talk about how to control it and how to measure it, because one of the big thing with agenda is data. So they talk a lot about how can we get people's data and use it and put it in a futures lab. So United Nations will develop a futures lab. They take in all the data for everyone. And they are pushing now also that we in the West will have to pay for the rest of the world to be included in this brain, and everyone should have this digital ID and everything included. Women, everyone should be part of it, and so we can get this data and then analyze it. And in order to more or less, it will be more like a digital crystal ball that you can look into and then see what might evolve. How do people act? Do we have problems here? Maybe we have a crisis. So they analyze this data and they can put in measures. So one of the things that they want to achieve is an emergency platform, an automatic emergency platform. So when they decide we have a crisis, they can put up this emergency platform and just shut down the world for whatever reason. And that's things that is in this report, and it's mind-blowing to read this material.
And this again, and this is what I love about the way you approach things, is you stick to what's published, and only what's published, data that's available, like you say. And the thing is, they actually do publish it. It's just not disseminated amongst people, but you can take it and look at it and say, that's clearly nuts. So that's a digital prison. That's a digital dystopia. I don't care who you are or whether you deny that there's bad actors like the UN that are going to lead us into some kind of problem. Your description just there is written, it's on paper, it's what they're saying, and anyone with a brain would say, that's dangerous. That is as dangerous as nuclear technology. I mean, it could be more dangerous. We never had a nuclear war because of the mutually assured destruction, the MAD. So the technology could have ruined the world, but because it was so bad and so obvious to everyone, so terrifying, it actually kind of disarmed itself so far. Ukraine. But anyway, so far. But this technology won't have that self-disarming nature. It's quite the opposite. It will tend to propel into dystopia. By its nature, clearly by its description, that is never going to get harnessed by the right people in the long run. I mean, whatever about the people now driving it being bad people, shall we say, or naive people or crazy people, I think is a fair to crazy people. But in the longer run, it will be taken over by people who see enormous power and control. So if it's not being run now by bad people, it will be soon. Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that are involved in this report, I mean, it's the same people that were running the show at the pandemic. So
yeah,
Bill and
Melinda, you got your answer.
Foundation are huge into this. We give a lot of money to have. I mean, when we have the WHO, and that's a part of this report as well. Yeah. And the thing is, nobody know anything about this report. And that's, I mean, if I ask 100 people on the street, I don't think anyone will ever know that United Nations had meetings about this and what this what they want to achieve. They don't know. Yeah. Have no idea because no media outlet tell them. There's no discussion. But the United Nations, they say that they have an open debate and people can come in and tell. They ask people to actually tell them what they think about this report and what should be done. And the funny thing, I was had to check this. We have this high-level panel that are working with this report, and they are coming out with an own report on how to achieve this agenda. And I was on their web page, and they actually have a page about public consultation. And so you can go in there and write what you think, and but of course they had the questions are more, you can't tell them what you want. They tell you what you can actually.
It's a menu.
Yeah, it's a menu. And it's not open anymore. So I think it was closed in August last year. It was open from the March. High-level panel was launched, and it was closed in August. And we also have a little commercial about these panelists. Talk about how it's important this for ordinary people to actually be a part of this and tell them what we think and everything. And this little commercial, do you know how many views, how many people that actually have been watching this? It was published, like over a year ago. Any guess?
I'm guessing a very small number. They just made it for optics, that they could say they technically did make it and they informed, but it only a couple of thousand views on YouTube or something, or
365.
Jesus. Oh. And what
and we talk about this democratic participation, and all these things that these United Nations people talk about. But we are living in their own world.
So I'm a numbers guy, like I said. So that's around 1 billion people in the West, US and Europe. And 100 would be 1 in 10 million. So 300 is 3 in 10 million people have checked it out on our behalf.
Yes.
Nuts. So,
wrong.
Yeah, I remember National Medical Care. I worked in the early 90s, FDA regulated dialyzer production development. And we went through a phase of open door, and it was a very tense time where a lot of people got fired because the FDA blocked our product, and there were problems with the laboratories, and not big problems, but they could just stop your shipping to America, which is a big deal. So they fired a few lab people, and they even fired an MD, a managing director, because with the FDA, you kind of had to fire people to show them you were serious. And then they'd nod and they'd be happy. That's the way it worked. But they had the open door policy suddenly came up, that these are difficult times and we have an open door policy now, and you can walk into the office of the managing director. His name was Ron. And this all came, we knew it was bullshit. Open door. Anyone can go up and let him know if there's stuff going on, and it'll all be fine and we'll take it on board. And we immediately, the Irish engineers at the time, just said, open trapdoor. You walk up to Ron's office and you go in there and you start saying stuff, boom. That's the way it was. And this is back in the 90s, but this is the corporate way. It's all words, it's all bullshit like this thing.
Yeah, that's how, kings and emperors has worked before. We have this day. Now people can come and tell what they really think.
And then they'll disappear.
And afterwards, they know, okay, I know that's the guy we have to take out.
Yeah. And, by people not wearing masks, we often kind of said that by not wearing a mask because they're utterly unscientific, sinister, dystopian nonsense. I always have to say that about masks because they were one of the worst things of this whole madness. But by not wearing a mask, of course, you were identifying as someone who was not an idiot, who complied. And similarly, they did that with the vaccine and the certs. It was to highlight and polarize the people who are critical thinkers and were not going along with this madness. But then they identify themselves and their family get uncomfortable with them. And so many relationships were destroyed. I haven't talked to certain people in my family since summer 21. And I don't care because this is a battle for our futures. And I have 5 children. It's the battle for the children's future. I don't care who I lose, who falls for this madness or who defends it. And that's just the way I am. But, Yeah, that's interesting. UN, actually, just the last thing in the UN, yes, the Rockefeller's private club, but that was back further. Now they've evolved themselves with loads of new players and Schwab and WEF. And the Rockefellers are probably falling back a bit from important driving roles, I'm guessing. And I noticed last year there was an announcement, the media just simply didn't cover it. The WEF have officially joined forces with the UN.
Yes, it was in 2019.
Oh, it was 19, was it?
Yeah, 2019. So I mean, it's just the year before the pandemic, and then they agreed to work together, and WEF would help out with Agenda
Help.
2030. Yes.
And ID 2020.
Everything. And the autumn they declared the United Nations. They declared the Decade of Action, and they had this motto: shaping the future together. Together with the big corporations, of course. So I mean,
Oh God, people! I try not to have contempt for my fellow man, but it has been difficult the last few years not having contempt. And you know, I've said to people, and this is kind of a harsh story, but people wearing masks and you see their eyeballs looking at you and they're not happy you're not wearing a mask. And when I was a kid, I worked with a friend of mine whose father had a farm, and occasionally we had to get the bulls, young bulls, and they'd get crushed, as in their vas deferens or whatever, and their testicles was crushed to turn them into bullocks. You know, it's a tough process. But I used to have to help in holding the bar that would keep them in the crush, where my friend's father would do the veterinary work. And I always remember their eyeballs, just like as they're kind of put in a crush and caught, the rolling eyeballs. That's what I was reminded of 35 years later. People wearing masks and looking at you. You're not wearing a mask. Bovine eyes. And look, that's harsh, but these last few years, I am so shocked with my fellow humans that they could fall for such patent nonsense like we've described. Stuff that is self-evidently absurd.
yeah, it's so easy to check out. It's very easy, but they have made people more stupid. So.
They have. I said this at a friend of mine who's into psychology as well. He's kind of an autodidact. He runs large companies. I won't say too much because he stays anonymous, but an incredible guy, or engineer originally. And he told me in May 2020, in a big discussion, our wives were there, and we were all discussing this. And I kept saying, but it's insane. And I was giving him the data. And he was saying, Ivor, they don't care. And he kept repeating this, and I had a couple of glasses of wine, and then I realized he keeps saying that, and he doesn't just mean he's dismissing me. He's actually giving me a message. So I just stopped, and I says, okay, why do you keep saying they don't care? I know people are idiots, but... And he said, Ivor, I've watched this for the last 30 years. There's a lot of safety-related stuff, obviously, in my leadership roles. I've watched people become safest. The whole industry, everything's become safety. I've watched it with fascination. And he also mentioned the climate stuff because he's a super brain engineer. He checked that out, and he's involved in energy. So he was actually aware the climate stuff and rising tides was kind of nonsense. He said, I've watched people become stupid, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, and he has lots of kids, and they went to school, and he watched the school system turning into idiocy. Just what you mentioned. And he said, the people in this thing are going to believe it. And when this vaccine comes out in a year's time or whenever, they're going to take it in the majority. And I said, really? And he says, yeah. He said, because they don't care. They only care about their phone now and their own little lives. And they basically will swallow any nonsense that comes from the experts. He said, that's the people we have now around us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Have you seen the movie Idiocracy? You have?
I have, because my co-author, Dr. Jeffrey Gerber in Denver, we wrote a book, Eat Rich, Live Long. It's the best book on diet and health and longevity in the universe, I think. But it's 350 scientific references, so we spent years on it. But he loved that movie, and he kept referring to the character. And I thought, this can't be as funny as Jeff saying he's probably just got that kind of sense of humor. But I watched it eventually because my 14-year-old son came and told me, hey, this movie looks really good. And we watch movies together. So I said, okay, I'll finally watch it. And Jeff was right. It was brilliant.
Yeah, but it didn't take 500 years to
Yes.
get people to get.
We're there now. And Jeff
Yeah.
used to refer to it in his metabolic talks, because we've both been on stage all over the world, in Israel to across to Europe and Mallorca and America, East and West Coast, at nutrition conferences, and we both speak. But he'd often refer to this, but he was giving it as the example as how idiotic the kind of cholesterol hypothesis is, and all this high carb diet stuff that comes straight from industry, nutrition and pharma. They've been pushing this for 30, 40 years. It's nonsense science. And he used idiocracy as an example, but now here we are. We've got a much bigger example. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think now we've covered that? If people go and watch the actual structured talk, that's not me butting in all the time, that 40-minute really gives you the full smooth history through to today. Do you think we've covered it pretty much? Because people won't watch big, long interviews anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, maybe they have got some bits that make them more interesting now. Maybe.
They will, because the comments on when I released your talk, I spent a few hours editing it just to streamline it and make it even more watchable, because people these days are attention spans. But overwhelming feedback that the people who were aware of a lot of this, they all got new pieces, just like I had. And other people who were not aware of this, overwhelmingly the feedback was, oh my God, it's so clear. Like, that this is a long game plan.
Yeah,
and they're just astonished.
When you have all the pieces put together, it becomes very clear. So
that's it. That's what I loved about it.
Trying to do, that's what I'm trying to do in my books as well. I want to present the big picture so that it will be easier for people to navigate.
Absolutely. And you know what? I'll put the links down directly to order the books. And the last one, the brain, that's in English also, or just the other one?
Yeah, it is translated now. My wife is working with it now in the kitchen, I think.
Oh, it's being translated now, but not on the market.
So my wife works with me, so she's doing the translation now for it, and so I hope. But the best thing, what I really need, is a publisher that is operating from, UK and Ireland, and because it's very expensive to send books, because we do everything ourselves here in Sweden, but it's expensive to send books.
Yeah, I do know a publisher that
is interested in these things. So, yeah.
I do know a publisher that's gotten involved in lots of controversial books in the nutrition sphere, diet and health. This material may be outside their kind of general remit, but I do know personally, I'll check out a couple of leads. No promises, but they might possibly. And yeah, you never know. And any last thing? No, I'll put the links there. We're going to be talking again. I'm no doubt about it, Jakob, because this story is so enormous. We're already touching on it. There's so many other facets that we rightly didn't try and get into today, like, because there's overload. But over time, for sure. And last thing, I'm a kind of I was a Francophile, like a France lover, my whole life. Not so much now since Macron. But Sweden, myself and my wife both absolutely love Sweden. I've been there several times. And in fact, I launched my movie there, The COVID Chronicles. I'll send you a link to it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we launched it in Stockholm, and we had a doctor there, a Swedish emergency doctor, who's been brilliant over this pandemic period. And we did a stage thing and Q&A, and it was fantastic. So we're going to be back. And I also have a business interest there potentially, which is going to have me back in Sweden. So we'll do a in-person.
We'll have to meet then and maybe do something and talk. Yeah.
Exactly. We'll do a series of maybe vignettes in person with my HD cameras at some point.
Yeah.
We'll do it. Thanks so much, Jakob.
Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Till next time. Bye now.
Yeah, bye.
Hope you enjoyed that, folks. And I do realize that a lot of the content is explaining things that can be a trifle upsetting, shall we say. But I've no doubt if people become aware, share, discuss what's actually going on, that awareness will spread and there will be pushback against the kind of lunacy of what's been going on over the years and indeed decades. So really appreciate, as always, the support I'm getting through Patreon. Continue to get, but great if other people can hop on board. I do monthly Zooms for the higher level patrons, and I also share vlogs and other content. So PayPal also, or any other way you can support me, really appreciate that. As I always remind people, we've lost the main media. They're pretty much subverted and they just pour nonsense into the ears of the population. Dangerous and damaging nonsense, unfortunately. So really important that we do what we can to have proper investigative journalism, to share the data, the science, and the reality of what's going on in the world. To be quite honest, reality is what we need to get out there and have people aware and able to push back with their local politicians or whatever avenues they have in order to prevent the worst of the worst happening in the long term. So thank you so much, folks.